CVSP 201 lecture on Plato. Shouldn't take too long, most of the hour, but not forever. So I'm Eric. Welcome to the semester. I guess it's halfway done, so it's a little late. In any case, let's jump into Plato here, yeah? Plato's Republic is a work of the 4th century BCE, Greece. The work is famous for Plato's discussion of justice, of the timeless forms or ideas, and philosopher kings. My intention today, let me turn this light on. Okay, no light. My intention today is to focus primarily on Plato's defense of an ethical theory of justice against the character Thrasymachus, and the philosophical and political work Plato finds himself getting into to defend such a theory. Now, to distinguish this, the readings you have for your course are, I think, specifically focusing on the cave and the forms. So I'm going to be doing a complete overview of the Republic, of its primary arguments, giving you a kind of circumnavigation of the whole sea. So this is going to depart a little bit from what you're reading, have read, or will read in class. This is the wider view. So perhaps that's probably to advantage to those of you who aren't getting the Republic as a whole. Okay. I argue that to study the Republic solely in terms of either its political or its philosophical lessons is not really to see the whole picture, right? And that's pretty much what you focus on in either one or the other in your course materials. In fact, I go as far as to argue that wherever philosophy is, there too is politics, and vice versa. They go together. Nowhere is this more true than on the pages of the Republic, where the whole venture into philosophy, as we will explore today, is launched by a crisis of political legitimacy, right? How the state should look. To answer a philosophical question, he has to go off into politics. To answer a political question, he has to go into philosophy. This symmetry between politics and philosophy was once taken up by a pair of common lectures. We used to have 2 common lectures for Plato that have now been reduced to 1, but I will be trying to tell the whole story today. Before I jump into the dialogue itself, it is important to set the context of the debate between the sophists and the Eleatics, right? Plato being with the Eleatics. On the one hand, we have the sophists, who, like the rebellious Thrasymachus of Book 1, I'm not sure you've read that, of the Republic, believe that there is no truth except what we humans think, and that democracy allows each to express their own truth, right? On the other hand are those like Plato and the Eleatics before him, who argue for a permanent realm of ideas, providing a standard of truth anywhere and at any time, which can only be understood and applied by a philosophical elite. And this is so, today, seeing Plato making his arguments through Socrates, his philosophical puppet, we see him making an anti-democratic argument in favor of permanent truths to be created and promulgated and deployed and applied through philosopher kings who rule because of their intellect, not because of their citizenship. With this, we have introduced the 2 camps of the sophists, Thrasymachus, and the Platonics, and we may begin our descent into the dialogue. At the end of the day, we can look at the Republic as a whole, as a theory of an ideal political community, or polis, as they called it in their time, based on a version of justice, and judge its worth from this point of view. Plato's spokesman in the dialogue, his puppet and his former teacher, Socrates, was actually his real-life teacher. And as we will see, his teacher's life and death, right? His teacher was put to death for his ideas, had a great influence on his theory of politics, justice, and power, and that's really how one way in which the Republic can be looked at, kind of a vengeance for Socrates' being put to death by the community in Athens, the Democrats. It is Thrasymachus' challenge which largely sets the stage for the Republic. Thrasymachus argues that justice is, quote, nothing else than the interest of the stronger, of those who rule, and that might makes right. That justice is a lie or myth to justify power as it is found in the political world. Thrasymachus' position is rejected by Plato's spokesman, again, Socrates, who argues that rulership should never take the interest of the ruler as primary. By definition, rulers shouldn't rule for themselves, but in the interest of the ruled. This is Plato's response. Despite his refutation of Thrasymachus' position, Socrates has yet to provide a positive definition of justice himself, and sets out to do so. With this, the work of the Republic, on Plato's terms, has begun, right? Everything beyond Book 1. Socrates and his main discussants, Glaucon and Adeimantus, agree to take up the search. They agree to search for justice first at the larger level of the state, and then only to find justice in the individual afterwards. And justice will look like something like happiness for the individual person. It means that all parts of your soul are in balance. Harmonia. This deductive procedure seeks the individual through the lens of the larger body politic and is oriented towards viewing the individual part specifically as a part of the whole, right? Everything must have its place in the whole for it to be legitimate for Plato, right? The whole comes first, the particular afterwards, right? Organicism. Socrates moves towards an understanding of justice considered aside from its rewards, right? With a view to the essential good and evil which justice and injustice bring to those who exercise them. Thus, Socrates and his friends set out to show that justice is not only best for the happiness it brings, but also best in and of itself, regardless of its consequences. And this brings their inquiry into the ideal form of the state to a beginning. Socrates starts his theory of the state by laying out the economic organization that he argued was necessary for it to exist. He laid out the basic divisions of labor, right? He holds as the conditions of life allowing a community to flourish. Merchants, workers, and buyers all interact to provide the variety of goods necessary for life. Division of labor. Each type of labor must be performed by those who are best fit for that work, such that the division of labor itself most efficiently utilizes the natural abilities and potentials of all of its citizens. Right? As the city's needs and wants expand, and remember, this is a thought experiment. They're building up the city from the division of labor, and they're going to build up to the state. It's a big thought experiment. What should a city look like? How does it begin? As the city's needs and wants expand into a city of unlimited desires, which Glaucon called what? Does anybody remember? The city of pigs, right? All right. There will be a demand for an expansion of land in order to provide for growing wants and needs, or the pigs. Right, us, those who have unlimited desires within the city, right? This leads to the need to expand and for further trade and for further accumulation of wealth. With this, Socrates informs that they have discovered war, right, warfare, to be derived from causes which are also the causes of almost all the problems of the state, greed. From these beginnings of the search for justice in the state, the harmonization of differences and the suppression of conflict are taken as constitutional principles of political order. This, in a nutshell, is what Plato's after: harmony, order, unity. Here then, unity, not diversity, which is something in liberal arts education, in liberal democratic societies we value, right? Diversity. Not important, not something that's high on Plato's list of priorities. To the end of the state's economic and territorial expansion, a place of military training becomes necessary, and the division of labor is once again applied so that those who are most fit to fight will be members of the army. Socrates turns to the analogy of the courage of dogs, famously, thumos, courage, as epitomizing spirit in order to imagine a class of soldiers, a permanent class of soldiers who will prove dangerous to enemies but soft and friendly to citizens. Right? Dogs are friendly to those they know and vicious to those they don't know, and this was his ideal metaphor for how a soldier would act. To the end of the state's economic and territorial expansion, right, I've already read that. The most fitting education for the soldiers, Socrates finds in music and gymnastics, right, harmonizing the soul. A strong program of censorship is set up in order to encourage some themes and to repress others. All harmful example of passions, irrationality or cowardice, such as we saw in Gilgamesh or in the Odyssey, from the Greek poets or myths, are to be eliminated from the education of the youth, who will have to be brave soldiers and defenders of the polis, the city. The state should produce myths, and the rulers censor and lie for the public good. Right? Sounds a little bit like our politicians today. Plato now pushes the dialogue onward to ask the primary political question: who shall rule? Who should rule? He begins his search for the best rulers in holding that the best amongst the old must rule the young. This elite should rule for the common people, but not be of the common people, right? So it's the elite, permanent caste of citizens. Not everybody can rule. He's, again, against democracy. At this point, Plato fashions his political myth of the metals, the myth of the earth-born castes, right? Let me explain that. His famous myth of the metals. Here the young must be taught that their training and early education, in fact their birth, was of the Greek soil, of the Greek earth, which has given them a specific nature, gold, silver, or bronze, and that the Greek soil from which they were born is their true mother, which should be loved and defended from all enemies, right? So children taken away from their mothers and fathers and told that the soil is actually the Greek earth, the Greek territory is actually their mother, and to inspire in them their primary allegiance to the soil itself as defenders. The identification with a class of metals dictates a citizen's rank, their caste in society, politics, and as well as their social identity and destiny, right? Born into silver or bronze or gold, die in that same caste. The purity of these castes is to be guarded for Plato, as there is nothing which should be so carefully guarded as the purity of the race, these three castes, which we'll discuss a little bit more, right? The highest of the rank of the guardians find their purpose in the protection of the Constitution, which takes as its primary purpose not the disproportionate happiness of one class, but the greatest happiness of the whole, right? For those of you who are studying Mill, like Miss Ballou's over there, John Stuart Mill, coming from the utilitarians, also greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? Greatest good for the greatest number. At this point in his development, Plato's working up the basics of his state from its very foundations. In starting at the level of appetite with the material production and consumption, Plato addressed his city at the first and lowest level first, the bronze level, right? Producers, workers, common citizens. That is, he worked upwards toward the ideal of justice from the lowest levels of material, right? Material exchange first, and human appetite. Now, with the education and the role of the warrior class in development, he has moved upwards from appetite and desires of the working class to the passions and emotion of the warring class, the silver class. In contemplating his four highest virtues, courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, Socrates declares justice to have been discovered in the division of the state itself, right? He's found justice in his definition of the way the state is broken up. That is, justice here is seen in the differentiation, right? The division of the city into its various specialized tasks: workers, guardians, and rulers, the gold. Justice in each part, right, is doing what it does well. In terms of class functioning, this means the laboring class obeying, the bronze, the brave bronze warriors defending, and the wise golden guardians ruling, each of these in harmony with the other, creating the overall good of the whole. Justice only comes through the whole. Having found justice in the state, right, which is the collection of the whole, Socrates now returns to the question of justice in the individual person, in the soul, right? Psychology. To begin, Socrates moves to articulate the structures of the soul, of the psyche, the mind. The structures of the self, which he claims make up a person, the fundamental building blocks. The three classes found in the state have an analogy and an equivalence at the level of the soul and are translated to appetites, emotions, and intellect, right? Each one higher than the one before it. In short, the animal, the emotional, and the intellectual, right? And as goes the soul, so goes the state, right? Each one being above the one before it, rules over it. As the just state goes, so goes the individual. It will not lie, nor cheat, nor steal, so long as each part functions to carry out its own business, unimpeded in harmony with its counterparts. It is only with the meddlesomeness, the interference of the inferior in the rising up of a part of the soul against the whole, that the soul is rendered into corruption and deformity, and what goes for the soul also goes for the city. Each part must obey and maintain its station and its rank in the overall ordering of the city. Otherwise, we get civil chaos, disorder, and strife. Justice in the soul, as in the state, means that each part is doing its own business, whether in ruling, to use an Aristotelian term, whether it's in ruling or being ruled. With this, Socrates declares that Thrasymachus' equation of justice with domination and power, right? Domination and power being associated by Thrasymachus with happiness, right, has been defeated, as it serves no one to be miserable and sickly, either of body or soul, because domination means that there's imbalance. And if there's imbalance, there cannot be happiness, either at the level of the individual or the state. Therefore, Thrasymachus' definition as might making right, the domination of some or the others, can't be a good one, can't be justice. The soul of the just person must find harmony within itself, and if any part is out of place, it imbalances the whole soul, right? Happiness becomes impossible, and misery is the result of Thrasymachus' definition. In response to his colleagues' requests, right, Socrates thinks that the dialogue's over at this point, but Glaucon and Adeimantus, his interlocutors, and I think Glaucon being his brother, aren't satisfied. They want him to go further into politics. They now return to the question of the state. At their request, Socrates will do so. Declaring the issue of class conflict in the city resolved, as each part of the polis has accepted its rank and its function, Socrates restates his confidence in the overall harmonization of the classes and citizens, where all are of one opinion, right, about what is near and dear to them. They all tend towards a common end, right? Plato speaks of the polis also as being one sensitive organism. If you hurt one part, all parts are hurt. It's one body, the familial body or the polis body, right? With this, Glaucon, his interlocutor, his discussant, asks Socrates whether he's actually made the case that their ideal state is possible, given history and human nature. Is this something that we can make happen and make real? With this question, the essential or quintessential Platonic moment of the dialogue has arrived. Here we begin to fathom the interaction of timeless universal ideas of good on the one side and historical forms of justice in the polis on the other, and their prospects for integration. That is, how do we make compatible the ideal, right, which is what we've dealt with to this point, and the real world of history and persons, needs, interests, and historical overdetermination or tradition, right? How do we change that and make it cohere with a higher, more perfect ideal, right? Can we get it out of our heads, this perfect idea, and make it practical? With so much of the life and ordering of the polis family, as I mentioned, described, some of which I've left out in terms of common holding of wives, right? The idea was that there would be a communism of women in Plato's Republic. I'm not going to go into that. The communism of property as well, and the organization of mating, because all mating, bronze, silver, and gold, would have to be managed by the state, right? I'll leave that to the side. What has arrived is a consideration of the viability of the ideal state. Does its status as an ideal make it a historical impossibility, right? Is it just a pipe dream? Is it just a fanciful intellectual dream for the likes of John Lennon? Does a conflict between Plato's ideal and the real run through time, through history, so as to make his ideal city foolish, as many have and continue to claim? That is, to what universal and timeless map can reason, on Socrates' account, refer in order to plot, to navigate the good political course through history that Plato's aspired to? How do we bring the heavenly ideal down and make it happen here on earth, right? What revolutionary mechanism is required? It is the metaphysical question of the conceptual foundations of justice, that's a big mouthful, but we'll explain it, of justice for the polis which Plato now has to address. What are the ideal, perfect, timeless ideas, metaphysical, that allow us to make that politically real? The interplay of the real and the ideal, or what Socrates calls in the Republic the third wave, as the greatest and heaviest, is now tackled by Plato. It's the third wave because he's dealt with several waves before, and he sees this as the biggest, the tsunami. He has to overcome this one. It's the hardest one to deal with. Because in principle, in definition, he's overcome Thrasymachus, but can he do it in practice? How could we make this golden class of rulers and apply their power in the real world that we know, which is so messy and full of chaos and disorder? History is clearly in rebellion against the realization of Plato's idealistic words and dreams. Nevertheless, he claims that just because such a state has never existed does not mean that it is not an ideal, and if it is an ideal, clearly it ought to be possible. Conditional upon this revolutionary political transformation being brought about, Plato places one of his most famous claims on Socrates' lips, right? Until philosophers are kings and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, right? Cities will never have rest from their evils. Until philosophers are kings, cities will never have rest from their evils. So in some sense, we need, right, Plato's ideals and his idealistic vision to save us from ourselves, right? With this bold statement, Plato makes the philosophical conditions for his political program clear. It is the disclosure of the ideal through the philosopher's political rulership with which Plato seeks to establish political authority and to make it concrete in the world, ideal political authority. Plato here sounds his clear endorsement of the rule of a philosopher class over those commoner natures, the silver and the bronze, who are destined to be ruled, right? There is no ruling and ruling in turn. There is no democratic inclusiveness. You have your role in society according to your intellectual potentials, and that defines your destiny for your whole life. A caste system, right? If everybody knows what that means. With this bold statement, Plato makes, right, okay, I've already done that. Against the real world politicians and sophists, that remember we started out at the beginning. The sophists believe that might makes right, that they're pro-democracy. They also teach philosophy for the sake of making money and fame. They think only of reputation, persuasion, and wealth, the sophists. Plato presents us in contrast with a philosopher who keeps his gaze, right, upon the permanent realm of ideas and is only interested in truth. The rule of the universal idea, right, the permanent ideas, is made the model for the correct ordering of the polis, right? As such, not the idea or opinion of the masses, right, but rather mathematics or logic of permanent truths, which we'll get into. As such, the rule of philosophical few requires Plato to dive into a philosophical defense of truth and its basis in the perfect ideas, which he calls the forms, the Platonic forms, right? Though the terms of the theory of the forms are in play here, the outlines of such a theory remains wholly beyond the bounds of the text so far. We really don't know what they are or where they can be found. This sets the stage of the dialogue and reveals a dramatic ascendance and moving upwards from the allegorical language of appearances towards Plato's language of the science of dialectic, which we will get into, from the world of the senses to the more real world of the mind and reason, because only with the mind can we truly see, as we will get into with the lion in the cave. Such a progression in the text mirrors the liberation of the mind, which is witnessed in the upcoming allegory of the cave. The moment has arrived to describe the true nature of philosophical practice and its content in terms of its innermost idea. A second education, the education of the philosophers, is now begun, which Plato bases on his central metaphysical scheme or theory of reality in the Republic, the doctrine of the ideal forms just mentioned. The ultimate unity of the system of ideas or forms, as will be examined, becomes the essence and ruling principle of the polis's political architecture and educational system for the rulers. Yet, as Adamantus, his discussant, brings out at this point, the problem remains as to how the ideal itself may be made to replace the corrupt Athenian reality and the poverty of democracy for which Plato has become such a famous witness. That is, how can we come to know and realize the ideal when there is so much resistance to it in the real world of corruption, common sense, hedonism, and political practice, right? Something of a common complaint in Lebanon with its particular organization of politics. How can the ideal overcome when, in some sense, political interests and political wheeling and dealing are entrenched in politics itself that would resist real idealism, right? And not just true for Lebanon, but true for many, if not most countries. 21st century politics. To answer this, Plato turns to develop a theory of knowledge and ideas in order to establish his philosophical method that his guardians, his gold ruling class, can use to rule. First through access to universal ideas, and then by translating them into political practice. So now we come to the divided line, and in some sense we're at the entering the heart, the holy of holies of the Platonic cosmos, the Platonic order. He here develops and delivers his theory, Socrates through Plato through Socrates, his theory of the divided line. The knowledge of the highest idea, reason and goodness, is grounded on the ultimate idea earlier discussed, the good. From this highest point of reference, thinking may once again descend to the lowest orders, right, to the lower levels of experience in order to bring order to diversity of phenomena registered by the senses, the data of the senses, the experience of the senses. This hierarchy of understanding is built up on 4 levels to which Plato assigns 4 mental faculties, which descend in the following order. Reason at the level of purest ideas, right? The good as an example. Intellect is that of mathematics, where numbers and shapes are understood on the second level. Belief at the level of raw sensory perception, where objects of perception are involved, right? What we see, which is already illusory, not real. And finally, at the very lowest level of knowing, imagination, right? Memory of things as we perceive them sensually. Thus, the highest level of knowing is understood with the mind alone. The senses shut off. And at the lowest, we are in the realm of imagination, not quite the world of the senses, but rather memory and mental imagery, which is a leftover of these sensory experiences, right? If the line then divides true knowledge from false opinion, then the implications await of this to apply to the realm of politics and justice, right? Socrates speaks of a progress of consciousness through which philosophical understanding may take a foothold in the real world and begin the process of bringing the heavenly ideal, the good, right, down to political realization to those who live in the cave of imagination. And we're going to go through the cave in a moment. Thus, the famous allegory of the cave is set off to describe the actual ideological and social conditions within which human consciousness, intellect, is held captive, diverted from the truth and ultimately perverted and corrupted, right? He's going to give us a theory of the world as it is and then show us how this divided line actually gives us a ladder to climb out of the cave of imagination and corruption towards beauty, good, and truth. Okay. The cave. In Plato's cave, this paradigm or parable of the cave, in society as he then saw it, because it is for him a metaphor for society, humans unknowingly carry out underground lives in the deep dark of the cave, and these are the prisoners at the far left bottom of the cave itself. Their arms and heads are bound, tied up, and their gazes are fixed upon a wall which the shadows of real objects are cast, right? So they're watching shadows being cast by their rulers, imagining that these shadows are in fact the real reality. A group of presenters, rulers, the powerful, create these shadows by manipulating objects and puppets between a bright fire and the wall where the shadows fall. For the audience, the shadows cast on the wall are taken as true reality. Voices are projected into the cinema in association with the shadow images which are taken as coming from the shadow objects themselves by the viewers. So television, Facebook, media, etc. A vision of society, right? This social and sensory indoctrination amounts to the world of nurture, right? Education, and would perhaps be best represented by education, law, art, media, tradition, and other social and political institutions which collectively form our worldviews and understanding of reality, our relationship with reality, right? Even when released from this captivity, right, the captivity to custom, convention, and sense and imagination, the prisoners refuse to give up the lessons of their previous captivity. They are comfortable with it. They want to keep these delusions and illusions and are not comfortable without them. Should these same captives be finally dragged out of the cave to the top right where we see the philosopher standing, into the light of the sun, which is the truth, and made to look into it, they would be blinded and go mad. They cannot. They are, in some sense, hopeless and helpless to do so, right? For those who escape the limits of the cave, their new point of reference will take time to adjust to and to finally embrace. These are the newcomer philosophers. Slowly they will come to see the light of day, the truth of being, of reality, without discomfort. Once having come to see the sunshine of the highest truth, not with the eyes but with the mind, the idea of the good, which is the sun, which is, I think, somewhere in the right, though it's a little bit shady. They will come to see the light of day, right? They naturally come to understand this as primary and a compass for human judgment, both philosophical and political, right? Absolute knowledge gives us a model not only for philosophical understanding of reality, but how to order our social and political lives. Having come to this startling escape, the newly liberated former citizens, former prisoners, now come philosophers, they must set their sights, like Neo in the Matrix, upon returning to the cave to liberate their fellows who are still held captive. Right? The philosophers who escaped through use of the mind, dialectic and reasoning and mathematics, must now re-enter the cave and help out those that are stuck in it. Right? I think that somehow education and educational institutions imagine that your professors are somehow also doing this task, right? Of coming back to you and doing that. Such a mission, Plato makes clear, would likely end in the philosopher's death, should they return back into the cave, right? Who would be treated as a revolutionary enemy or a terrorist, right? Threatening the status quo, right? Terrorist. Clearly, Plato had not forgotten the lesson of his teacher's plight, who was sentenced to death for his heterodox and unorthodox teaching, the very Socrates of the Republic itself. The real-life Socrates, not the Socrates of the Republic, was put to death very much for doing something like this, for teaching the youth alternative ideas, modes of criticism, and for challenging tradition. In Plato's ideal city then, the statesman requires the knowledge of the ultimate idea of the good through reason in order to be capable of rational political judgment. In having found eternal truth in the final idea of the good through reason, the philosopher returns to the cave of the polis with the blueprint for its reform and its perfection. Here the philosopher must rule as king, unchallenged, and as the one who has exclusively received the highest education. Not everybody can be a philosopher. In this way, Plato delivers his justification as to how one who has been trained to the guardian class must now be persuaded to give up a comfortable philosophical life of meditation and happiness, right? Because no higher happiness can a person have than meditating and knowing the true good. This is happiness because it puts your soul in order. And must now be persuaded back into the cave to free his or her fellows at the very jeopardy and risk of life and limb for the philosopher. Sounds like a bad deal, right? But they have to do it. With this, the true philosopher guardians have been found, and Plato considers his case for the practicality of his ideal city complete and closed. Okay. In conclusion, a few comments and concerns. Where Thrasymachus started out arguing that rulership is the art of exploiting the ruled, Plato turned this position around to its opposite, so that rulers themselves are committed to the rule of the forms as ultimate authority. In this sense, the philosopher is for Plato as much a political agent as a prophet, right? Conducting the sight of the community up to the light of the sun of ideas through the practice of philosophy, reason, and what he called dialectic. The absence of the philosophical rule and the heavenly city of the ideal forms in the real world of history and experience is thus a kind of purgatory, right? We're neither in heaven or hell, but stuck somewhere between. And I think that he would look at today's world and very much see us in that shape. This condition witnesses the tragic alienation of humanity, on Plato's terms, from its essential nature and its spiritual and intellectual potentials, right? We must admit, though, and we can see the religious dimension in the way the Middle Ages would take up Plato as a critique of the worldly from a religious and heavenly perspective. We must admit, though, that Platonic justice, as we see it completed here, is not attained through the willing agency of its citizens. And this is something that Aristotle would critique Plato for. The citizens aren't really involved. They're subjects and puppets of a larger order which they don't really understand. Rather, justice is found at the level of the organization of the polis as a whole and brings citizens, forces citizens, coerces its citizens into conformity with the ideal which very few citizens actually appreciate or understand. The realization of the ideal polis is thus not achieved through an education which takes the individual personality of its citizens as ends in themselves, as liberal arts education seeks to do, right? From this angle, the citizens exist for the city, as opposed to the other way around, where the city exists for the citizens, right? Somehow they are the building blocks of a city which has a life of its own beyond them. This distinction draws a marked line between the most basic individualistic presumptions of modern liberal education, AUB, for example, and Plato's radical concern with the preservation of harmony and the unified soul of the polis family. Individual opinion, perspective, and development just doesn't matter, right? In this rule of the one of justice, right, the state, the city, over the many of freedom, right, its citizens, Plato has set his city against what he saw as the ugly and inevitable consequences of democratic pluralism. And for him, democracy and pluralism ultimately inevitably lead to civil strife, war, and bloodshed between brother and sister, politically speaking. Despite this critical note, Plato's concern was first and foremost with the frequency of strife, conflict, and civil war in the Greece of his day. If we are going to try to understand Plato, there is little value in critically dismissing his political thought in favor of the liberal and democratic ethical standards of contemporary thinking. And this is, for example, the book The Open Society and Its Enemies, Volume 2, Karl Popper. He goes after Plato as being an enemy of liberalism, of modernity, of democracy. But I think that there's, against Karl Popper, there's actually little use in doing so, because Plato is responding to the demands of the 4th century BC, not 20th century, the context of the Second World War, as Popper was doing in his book, Open Society and Its Enemies. Right? Nonetheless, it is difficult not to see strong class prejudice in Plato's political order, as it is often explicitly expressed in his distaste and distrust for the middle and working classes. Manual labor, after all, working with one's hands, made one unfit for advanced education and leadership for Plato and for many of his peers, including Aristotle, right? There was viva contemplativa, those who work with their minds and those who work with their hands, and those who work with their hands simply were neither born nor fit to ascend to a higher order of understanding. To bring this all together, the structure and design of the Republic may be seen as a reflection of the revolutionary implications of the allegory of the cave and the hierarchy of knowledge illustrated in the divided line. The Republic as a whole somehow moves along the divided line from the bottom to the top, from imagination to the idea, and from the prisoners of the cave out to the philosopher who may yet liberate the cave. The movement of the dialogue from the conventional sphere of the senses to that of the ideal permanence of ideas reveals a teaching and philosophical strategy at work behind the dialogue. Plato slowly refocuses our eyes from the historical level of custom and convention and tradition to the ideal horizon of philosophy, from the earthly to the heavenly. This overall build-up from convention to ideal is a reflection of the movement of the soul, from the appetites to the passions, with perfection finally attained in reason. Each of these represented by the three castes within the polis and within the soul. With the myth of the metals behind him, Plato's protagonist, Socrates, then tackled the greatest challenge to his theory of the just state. What is the ideal ground and form of legitimate authority, politics, that only the mind can know, and which has never been historically seen, right? It is a science of politics, we might call it. It is not until this moment that the philosopher has played any substantial role in the construction of the city. Only with the philosophical training does the mind arrive at the conflict between the senses and the mind, so as to be capable of gaining perspective needed to witness the ideal forms which can be brought back to the world of politics and society and to reorder them. This evolution Plato took as a model for the foundation of an elite philosophical education, which raises the mind from its captivity in the many impressions of the senses, and by extension, to ultimately emancipate the politics as a whole from the wants, interests, and opinions of its many members, which plague it with internal conflict, right? The democracy is like our senses. We see one thing one moment, something is large, something is small, things are constantly changing. there is no center. We have to shut off the senses and immerse ourselves in philosophy and thought to see things, to see the world as it truly is, right? And democracy is not the method to do that. It is a chaos for Plato. We need to move to a unity and perspective of a philosophically ordered perspective, both for knowledge as well as for politics. Where Plato sought to bring the heavenly forms down to earth, the good, philosophical and political legitimacy are intertwined. He did this in order to bring an end to the chaos of the shifting sands of public opinion and sensory perception, where appearances, the senses, tyrannize over truth and desire over the mind. Plato's grand narrative of the state, we have to, for example, remember Odysseus tied to the mast of the ship, right? He has to go through the trials, but do it rationally, and so as not to be overcome by his senses and the call of the sirens, right? In some sense, philosophy is that discipline of the mind over the body, right? The cave dwellers to which he addressed himself were his fellow Athenians and Greeks, and the Republic itself becomes the educational exercise of the philosopher who has returned to the cave to free his countrymen and women by philosophical means. Plato here is the philosopher who has escaped the cave and who makes his return through the writing and circulation of the dialogue itself. So in some sense, the printing and distribution and oral recounting of the Republic as a text is Plato returning to the cave. On my reading, Plato, the author of the Republic, is the self-same heroic philosopher in the Republic. We know that Plato actually made several attempts to philosophically convert kings in Sicily to his political ideas. These attempts were unsuccessful, and on at least one occasion, Plato was almost put to death. He was imprisoned, but managed to escape. The Republic then seeks to avenge at least two wrongs inflicted on Plato, two injustices that Plato seeks to correct through the Republic. Firstly, the execution of his loved teacher, Socrates, who was put to death for his philosophical views and teachings. And secondly, the contempt and ignorance of the kings of his day, kings and politicians of his day, who chose power over justice and ignored wisdom for the sake of short-term gains. No comment. To close, two crucial takeaway questions. One, can we accept his theory of the immaterial forms? Do they make sense? Do they actually hold together? Right? Or is it merely a skeleton and a metaphor, a kind of poetry of truth? Or is there actually something to it? And secondly, can or should we agree with his ideal, his mode of politics and his political implementation and deployment of his ideal forms, his thoughts? With that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your semester. Thank you.